Section 41 of the Wonderful Adventures of Nils. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Wonderful Adventures of Nils by Selma Lagerlöf. Translated by Velma Swanston Howard. Vermland and Dalsland. Wednesday, October 5th. Today the boy took advantage of the rest hour, when Akka was feeding apart from the other wild geese, to ask her if that which Bataki had related was true, and Akka could not deny it. The boy made the leader goose promise that she would not divulge the secret to Morten Goosey Gander. The big white gander was so brave and generous that he might do something rash were he to learn of the elf's stipulations. Later the boy sat on the goose back, glum and silent, and hung his head. He heard the wild geese call out to the goslings that now they were in Dalarne; they could see Städjan in the north, and that now they were flying over Österdal River to Hormon Lake and were coming to Vesterdal River. But the boy did not care even to glance at all this. "I shall probably travel around with the wild geese the rest of my life," he remarked to himself, "and I'm likely to see more of this land than I wish." He was quite as indifferent when the wild geese called out to him that now they had arrived in Vermland, and that the stream they were following southward was Klarälven. "I've seen so many rivers already," thought the boy. "Why bother to look at one more?" Even had he been more eager for sightseeing, there was not very much to be seen, for northern Vermland is nothing but vast, monotonous forest tracts, through which Klarälven winds, narrow and rich in rapids. Here and there one can see a charcoal kiln, a forest clearing, or a few low, chimneyless huts, occupied by Finns. But the forest as a whole is so extensive one might fancy it was far up in Lapland. A little homestead. Thursday, October 6th. The wild geese followed Klarälven as far as the big iron foundries at Munkfors. Then they proceeded westward to Fryksdalen. Before they got to Lake Fryken it began to grow dusky, and they lit in a little wet morass on a wooded hill. The morass was certainly a good night quarter for the wild geese, but the boy thought it dismal and rough, and wished for a better sleeping place. While he was still high in the air he had noticed that below the ridge lay a number of farms, and with great haste he proceeded to seek them out. They were farther away than he had fancied, and several times he was tempted to turn back. Presently the woods became less dense, and he came to a road skirting the edge of the forest. From it branched a pretty birch bordered lane which led down to a farm, and immediately he hastened toward it. First the boy entered a farmyard as large as a city market place, and enclosed by a long row of red houses. As he crossed the yard he saw another farm, where the dwelling house faced a gravel path and a wide lawn. Back of the house there was a garden thick with foliage. The dwelling itself was small and humble, but the garden was edged by a row of exceedingly tall mountain ash trees, so close together that they formed a real wall around it. It appeared to the boy as if he were come into a great high vaulted chamber, with a lovely blue sky for a ceiling. The mountain ash were thick with clusters of red berries. The grass plots were still green, of course, but that night there was a full moon, and as the bright moonlight fell upon the grass it looked as white as silver. No human being was in sight, and the boy could wander freely wherever he wished. When he was in the garden he saw something which almost put him in good humour. He had climbed a mountain ash to eat berries, but before he could reach a cluster he caught sight of a barberry bush, which was also full of berries. He slid along the ash branch and clambered up into the barberry bush. But he was no sooner there than he discovered a currant bush, on which still hung long red clusters. Next he saw that the garden was full of gooseberries and raspberries and dog rose bushes, that there was cabbages and turnips in the vegetable beds, and berries on every bush, seeds on the herbs and grain filled ears on every blade. And there on the path no, of course he could not mistake it was a big red apple which shone in the moonlight. The boy sat down at the side of the path with a big red apple in front of him and began cutting little pieces from it with his sheath knife. "It wouldn't be such a serious matter to be an elf all one's life if it were always as easy to get good food as it is here," he thought. He sat and mused as he ate, wondering finally if it would not be as well for him to remain here and let the wild geese travel south without him. "I don't know for the life of me how I can ever explain to Morten Goosey Gander that I cannot go home," thought he. "It would be better were I to leave him altogether. I could gather provisions enough for the winter as well as the squirrels do, and if I were to live in a dark corner of the stable or the cowshed, I shouldn't freeze to death." Just as he was thinking this, he heard a light rustle over his head, and a second later something which resembled a birch stump stood on the ground beside him. The stump twisted and turned, and two bright dots on top of it glowed like coals of fire. It looked like some enchantment. However, the boy soon remarked that the stump had a hooked beak and big feather wreaths around its glowing eyes. Then he knew that this was no enchantment. "It is a real pleasure to meet a living creature," remarked the boy. "Perhaps you will be good enough to tell me the name of this place, Mrs. Brown Owl, and what sort of folk live here." That evening, as on all other evenings, the owl had perched on a rung of the big ladder propped against the roof, from which she had looked down toward the gravel walks and grass plots, watching for rats. Very much to her surprise, not a single grayskin had appeared. She saw instead something that looked like a human being, but much, much smaller, moving about in the garden. "That's the one who is scaring away the rats," thought the owl. "What in the world can it be? It's not a squirrel, nor a kitten, nor a weasel," she observed. "I suppose that a bird who has lived on an old place like this as long as I have ought to know about everything in the world. But this is beyond my comprehension," she concluded. She had been staring at the object that moved on the gravel path until her eyes burned. Finally curiosity got the better of her, and she flew down to the ground to have a closer view of the stranger. When the boy began to speak, the owl bent forward and looked him up and down. "He has neither claws nor horns," she remarked to herself. "Yet who knows but he may have a poisonous fang, or some even more dangerous weapon. I must try to find out what he passes for before I venture to touch him." "The place is called Mårbacka," said the owl, "and gentlefolk lived here once upon a time. But you, yourself, who are you?" "I think of moving in here," volunteered the boy, without answering the owl's question. "Would it be possible, do you think?" "Oh, yes, but it is not much of a place now compared to what it was once," said the owl. "You can weather it here, I dare say. It all depends upon what you expect to live on. Do you intend to take up the rat chase?" "Oh, by no means!" declared the boy. "There is more fear of the rats eating me than that I shall do them any harm." "It can't be that he is as harmless as he says," thought the brown owl. "All the same, I believe I'll make an attempt." She rose into the air, and in a second her claws were fastened in Nils Holgersson's shoulder, and she was trying to hack at his eyes. The boy shielded both eyes with one hand and tried to free himself with the other, at the same time calling with all his might for help. He realized that he was in a deadly peril, and thought that this time surely it was all over with him. Now I must tell you of a strange coincidence. The very year